Hi, and welcome to a discussion on anti-racism and race. We had a meeting at New Life Foursquare Church on Tuesday, the 30th. Was that the 30th? It was. And we recorded it. It was great. It was a great meeting. We had some people on Zoom. We had people there. Unfortunately, the iPad that I was using to record the video filled up with memory. I have a lot of videos of my kids on it. It got only about half of the talk. I was kind of going back and forth as whether I just wanted to give half of it. And I felt like, no, I felt like there's a lot of good stuff that I wanted to bring up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the talk as it was given on Tuesday. And then also, because I know the questions that were asked at that time, so I'm going to respond to those at the end as well, because I thought that some of them were really good. But this is basically a discussion about what is race. What we're going to do before we get going, I want to talk a little bit about how we talk about race. Race is a very complicated, very complex idea and concept, and it has worked its way through a lot of society, a lot of the structures of society, from the way that we do education to government to even institutions like the church or your local swimming club, a book club. Race is one of the most comprehensive ideas within the American drama and also globally because of American imperialism and European expansion. The idea of race is very much a worldwide global phenomenon. And I think that what I'm noticing today, which is really good, when Trayvon Martin was killed, we had protests, and then since that time, Eric Gardner and so many others, and we've had these protests, and we kind of get caught into this cycle of somebody will get killed, murdered, and there'll be this moral outrage and uproar, and will protest, but not everybody will protest, but some people will protest, and then it kind of dies down a little bit until another person is murdered. And we're sort of caught in the cycle until George Floyd. There was something about George Floyd's death that really ignited something in a lot of people. And what I'm noticing is especially a lot of white people are starting to engage in these conversations, which is a really great thing. Like that's wonderful. The problem with it, though, is that for a lot of white people, their understanding of race is really limited because it is not really something that they've been engaging in for a long time. It's been sort of underneath the surface in their lives. And now all of a sudden they're realizing it's an issue and they want to go out there and do stuff. They want to change the structures. They want to change the world. And I love that. Like, that's great enthusiasm. But when you don't have the skills and the knowledge of what exactly is going on around you, you are not going to be as effective in bringing about change than if you had a little bit more education, a little bit more knowledge, so that you can go out and say, okay, I'm going to target that idea, I'm going to target that institution. This over here can wait, this over here is urgent, this over here is an idea that we need to strip away, this over here is a systemic issue that we need to deal with through legislation or something like that. So once you get a little bit more education, you can be a little bit more effective in your activism. And that's what this is really about today. If we continue to do these kind of talks, that's what it's going to be about. Trying to raise the level of education and knowledge so that we can be more effective in addressing these issues. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how we talk about race. And then I want to talk about what race is. So before we even get to what race is, I want to talk a little bit about how we talk about it. Whenever we talk about race or racism or white supremacy or similar topics, what we're doing is we're putting language to a lived experience. And we need to recognize that language has limits. Language is limited in describing an experience. If you were in love with someone and then you tried to communicate to somebody else what it means for you to love this person, you'll realize that language has limits. It can't fully communicate the lived experience that you have. And that's the same thing with race. We're going to use words. Words are going to be helpful, but they're limited to describe the lived experience of race and of racism. Furthermore, not just language, but our perspectives are limited. Our own lived experience is going to limit how we talk about race. So for a white person like myself, to talk about race is inherently suspect. My lived experience is not in congruence with the lived experience of a person of color. And my lived experience is going to be very different. It's going to limit my perspective. I'm going to give you an illustration. There's a story that at the end of World War II, American troops came into a concentration camp in Germany, and they liberated the camp, and they were so horrified by the emaciated, starving people that they saw there. They were so horrified. So they went to a German town near the camp, and they began pulling citizens out of their homes and off the streets, brought them to the camp so that they could see what was going on. A lot of these people had never gone to the camp before, but a lot of the soldiers were based in the camp. So they pulled all these citizens out and showed them the concentration camp. And understandably, the German citizens were pretty taken aback. And one American soldier turns to a German woman and asks her, "What do you think about, what do you think about this?" She said, "They must have done something terrible to be treated this way. They must have done something terrible to be treated this way." And I want you to recognize that her worldview or her lived experience had limited her ability to understand what was going on in this situation. In her mind, the only justification for people being treated as terribly as these people were treated was that they must be criminals. They must be terrible criminals. And I think we're really quick to say, "Oh, we condemn that woman. Oh, what a terrible, callous thing to say." But the reality is, it was her lived experience that limited her perspective. And we need to recognize in the same way when we talk about race, especially when white people talk about race, your lived experience is going to limit your perspective. It's gonna make things appear not as they are. It's going to lead you to conclusions and assumptions that may not be accurate. Recognize that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you 3 tools that are going to help you limit, if you're a white person. I recognize not everybody who may be watching this may be white, but this is something white people need to learn. We need to be able to limit our whiteness, limit our white perspective. We're that woman. We need to have some tools that are going to allow us to hopefully better understand the situation without a misinterpretation on our end. So there's 3 things. The first one is limit your own voice. Stop talking. Some of us just need to stop talking. And I realize that's very difficult to do. And especially for white people, that can be very difficult to do because we're used to people listening to us and we're used to talking. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just to be silent. And I would say, first of all, specifically, we need to be silent about racial epithets. This is like racial slurs. There is no good reason to ever, even if you're educating people, even if you're trying to denounce racism, even if you're, quoting a passage from a book or something, there is no reason for you to use a racial slur. Really, just put that aside. But that's not the only way we need to limit our voices. Also, we need to stop laying claim to the experiences of other people. All the time, you'll hear a conversation where somebody is explaining a real traumatic experience of racism, and then a white person will chime in with, "Oh yeah, I totally understand. It's like this. I was at the store the other day. They looked at me weird. I felt bad." No, your experience, your lived experience is absolutely not the same. So please stop laying claim to the experience of other people. And the third thing we can do to limit our voices is we need to recognize that sometimes we don't need to add anything. Sometimes we just can just be quiet and listen, and that's okay. That's okay to do. Number two, this is the second tool. Continue learning, continue pressing in, continue educating yourself. This video and whatever talks we have in the future, these are not sufficient to give you all the tools that you need, partly because I have limitations of my own. Now, hopefully, I've been through schooling, I paid a lot of money, so hopefully I have some knowledge, hopefully I have something to offer, but I'm not going to have everything to offer. And you need to especially attend to voices of color, people of color, whether that's reading books or listening to podcasts or watching a TED Talk or something like that. But you need to continue your education. I'm going to try to give out some resources. I'm going to put them down below, and especially books, resources that are coming from perspectives of people of color. So continue your education. A last tool that we need to have in our tool belt as white people engage in this, and that is recognize sacred space. Recognize sacred space. When people are sharing pain, when we talk about history and historical injustice, recognize that that's sacred space. We need to give these sorts of things the gravitas that they deserve. Imagine just for a second, you just close your eyes and imagine somebody that you love, somebody that you really love, and imagine that person being taken away from you. And don't dwell too deeply there, because that's a hard place to sit. But if you imagine what that feels like, and you can kind of get a taste of what that feels like, that emotional, where sort of your world just begins to drop out below you. Recognize the pain of that. During the slave trade, up to 2 million Africans, 2 million Africans died during the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was the trip between West Africa and usually the Caribbean. 2 million people. Some of them committed suicide. They resisted the idea of slavery in the first place, and they jumped off the ships. Some of them died of disease. Some of them died of, there's close quarters. They were stacked in the bottom of ships. And somebody would die down there, and their body would just sit there. And people around them would catch the same disease. 2 million people. They didn't even make it into slavery. Each one with a family, mothers, fathers, children. There's a need that we have to recognize that their deaths were not statistics. They were not numbers. They were people. 2 million individual people. That's the sort of respectfulness that we need to have when we enter into these conversations. We're talking about death. We're talking about life as well. There's a lot of life. There's a lot of wonderful life that came out of the oppression that people experienced. Not because of their oppression, but in spite of it. The life that came out of people that survived and what they were able to accomplish and overcome is incredible. We need to have respect for that. So we need to experience a sacredness to these conversations. We're talking about life and death. We're talking about real people, okay? With that in mind, what I'm going to do right now, and what I encourage you to do every time that we talk about this, is we're going to just take a moment. We're going to take like 30 seconds of just silence. I'm a pastor, I'm a Christian, so I'm going to take that time to pray silently to myself. If you pray, I encourage you, take the time to pray. If you don't pray, take the time to prepare your heart, prepare your mind. But let's just enter into this discussion with an understanding that this is sacred space. So would you take some time? Let's take some time right now just to sit in silence. the last introductory comment that I'll make, and then I'm going to start talking about what race is. But the last introductory thing I'm going to say is that sometimes we are tempted to assume that this right here is doing something. This is not doing something. Okay, recognize that. This is not anti-racism. Okay? Anti-racism is taking apart structures of white supremacy and dismantling them in our own lives and in our communities. This is not anti-racism. This is education. This is giving us the tools to do anti-racism, but knowledge is neutral. Recognize that knowledge is neutral. And that means that you get to decide what happens with the knowledge that you're going to gain today. You get to decide what you do with that. Do you participate in taking apart systems of racism, systems of white supremacy, or do you not? This is not the work, okay? But this is an important part of the work. You are not a good white person for clicking on a YouTube video. I'm sorry, that's not how it works. But it's good to learn more and to educate ourselves so that we're able to go out and to dismantle these sorts of ideas. Enthusiasm and endurance are not the same thing. A lot of people enthusiastic right now, and that's good. You know, I'm happy about that. But it's going to come in the next months, years, decades to determine whether that enthusiasm can be translated into endurance or not. So it's up to you, really. This is going to be helpful, I hope. You're going to learn something, I hope. But ultimately, it's up to you whether or not you take this information and do something with it in your own life. Okay, so for the remainder of the time today, what I'm going to do is kind of help to give us a framework for understanding what race is. If we don't understand exactly what we're dealing with, our approach to it is going to be less effective. I'm going to start with a definition of race, and we're going to unpack that definition. And I want to make clear that this is not the definition of race. This is a definition of race. I like this definition, and I'll kind of explain, why it is that I like this definition. Race is a social construct built with the assumption of whiteness and designed to prop up white supremacy. A social construct built with the assumption of whiteness and designed to prop up white supremacy. And so let's take that apart. The first thing that I want to say is race does exist. Race exists in our world, in our culture, in our society. It exists in the interactions we have with people. In the 80s, we had a movement called color blindness, where we were trying to move people away from discriminating against people groups because of their race. So we figured the best way to describe that would be to be colorblind, to not see somebody's race and therefore not discriminate against them. It might have had some really great intentions, but the result has largely been not helpful. So race does exist, and we need to acknowledge that. But the first part of the definition is race is a social construct. It's a way of interpreting humanity which is not dependent on biology. Race has absolutely nothing to do with your DNA or with your biology. That's an idea, I think, that escapes a lot of people, but it's a reality. Our bodies have been socially engineered to hold biological markers of race. What I mean by that is the human body by itself doesn't actually express any racial identity, but we have socially engineered ourselves and our bodies so that it communicates something about race. Now, I know that for a lot of people, the idea that race is not a biological reality can be a bit confusing. So I'm going to go ahead and give you some examples and kind of demonstrate this to you. Okay. So first, I want to start by looking at a little bit of history. In the 1920s, there was a Japanese man named Takao Ozawa, and he had been living in the United States for 20 years, and he had a family, and he worked, and he wanted to become a US citizen, go through the process of naturalization. So he went to the courts, and they said you can't. The reason you can't is because in the 1920s, the only people who could be naturalized citizens were free white persons or persons of African descent. And Ozawa, having been born in Japan, was denied. And he took the case, he sued to become a naturalized citizen, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1922. And what he argued, he didn't argue with the law. He didn't argue that the law was discriminatory. What he argued was that he was, in fact, a free white person, and therefore, under the law, should be allowed to be naturalized. And he argued that he's a free white person because look at the way that he lives. He has a family. He lives in areas where other white people live. His life reflects their life. There's no real social difference between him and the white people around him. Therefore, said Ozawa, I am a white person for all purposes of law, so I should be able to become a citizen. The Supreme Court unanimously rejected his claim. But what's really interesting is the reason they give. So in the majority opinion of the court, this is what it said. The words white person were meant to indicate only a person of what is popularly known as the Caucasian race. Basically what that's saying is, in other words, because you were born in Japan, you are not a part of the Caucasian race because race is biologically linked. And because your DNA does not communicate that you are Caucasian, therefore you are not white. 3 months later, in 1923, another case came before the court. Another case of somebody wanting to be a naturalized citizen. And this was a man named Bhagat Singh Thind. He had come to the United States some years earlier. He joined the US Army. He fought in World War I. He got to the rank of a sergeant, and then he retired, and he started a business, and he married a white woman, and he had a family. He petitioned to become a naturalized US citizen. And the state of Oregon, our state, rescinded his citizenship, and so he sued. And again, it went straight to the Supreme Court. So 1923, he appeared before the Supreme Court, and he argued, again, didn't argue with the law, but what he argued was because he's a high caste Indian from India, and because the lineage of Europeans comes out of India, because there's relationships between the Indo-European languages, which you can study in linguistics if you want, he argued his DNA is the same as white European DNA. So he was white. In other words, because Europeans came out of India eons ago, and because he came out of that same stock, his biology, he had a biological argument for the existence of his own whiteness. Now, do you think that it worked? Do you think the Supreme Court allowed him to become a citizen? No, it did not. Once again, unanimously, the court rejected his application. But what's really, really interesting is the majority opinion. The reason why he wasn't a white person. Listen to what they said. The word Caucasian is to be understood as words of common speech and not of scientific origin, written in the common speech for common understanding by unscientific men. In other words, the court said, because Bhagat Thind would not be identified by the common person as a white person, it doesn't matter that his biological or DNA shares with the white race. What matters is the common interpretation by the common man of what race this man is. Now, isn't that incredible? They reject one guy Because although he looks white, although he acts white, although he may be commonly understood as white, his DNA was not white. But then they reject the next guy because even though his DNA might be white, he doesn't look white and he doesn't act white. What is that communicating to us? What it communicates is race is nothing to do with your biology. Only when it is to our benefit, only when it was to the court's benefit, did the court consider biological information or social information. It's completely arbitrary who is white and who is of another race. It is absolutely nothing to do with your biology. And I want to take it, this is some stuff I didn't share. I might have shared, but I decided not to the other night. So we're going to look at a picture now of several different arms, right, of different shades, skin tone. Skin tone is often cited as a reason that people give as an explanation for why your race is in your DNA. Oh, well, it's because of your skin color and your skin color is DNA. Look at these arms. Can you identify the race of each of these arms? Not just of one or two, but could you go down the line and tell which one's Hispanic? Which one is from India? Which one's Native American? Which one is from Africa? Which one's from Europe? Which one's from Eastern Europe? You can't do it. It's impossible. So what are you doing? You're asking the question, we need more information. Well, isn't that interesting? Because if skin tone, which is linked to your DNA, was a true indicator of race, you shouldn't need any more information. You only need more information because skin tone is not an indicator of race. Let's look at hair texture. Hair texture is another thing that people cite as a biological basis for race. Look at these hair textures. Which one of these hair textures belongs to a Latino person? Which one of these hair textures belongs to a white person? Which one of these hair textures belongs to a black person? Which one of these hair textures belongs to an Asian person? Can you tell, can you definitively tell which one belongs to what race? No, you can't. Why? Because hair texture does not contain racial information. It's just hair texture. See, it's incredible. We build these ideas of race on nothing, on absolutely nothing, on our own social indications. One last example to prove it to you. I'm going to show you a picture of a man. What race is this man? Barack Obama. Everybody knows him. What's his race? If you looked up in Wikipedia, he is the first African-American president. He's African-American. That's his race. That's the race that he is. But take a look at a picture of his mom and his dad. How could he be African-American? How could he be African-American when 50% of his DNA comes from a white woman? Literally half, 50% of his DNA comes from a white woman. How could he be African-American? Because DNA does not have anything to do with your race. He's perceived as African American. We have told him he's African American, and that's what makes him African American. The common people have decided that he is African American, and that's what makes him so. This means that your race can change. It can change based on your context, your speech patterns, your history, your geography. It changes based on whether you were born in the 50s or the 80s or today. Your race changes over time. During slavery, it was not uncommon for male slave owners to rape their female slaves. Not uncommon. But they didn't want to allow their own children, illegitimate children, to escape slavery. And so there was a rule called the one-drop rule, which basically means if you have any African descent in your line, then you are black in reference to the law. It doesn't matter if it was your great-great-grandfather and everybody else was white. If one person in your lineage was black, then you were black according to the law. Understand the importance, the power of that reality. It means that no matter what your DNA was, no matter who gave you your DNA, you were black, and that means you were subject to slavery. One plantation owner's wife commented in her journal that every woman in the county knows where the light-skinned slaves come from on every plantation but her own. As a reality. Think, think for just a moment. Again, I want to push past just knowledge. Think for just a moment of what it would be like to be a black woman living on a plantation. And you have a choice in front of you. Are you going to try your best to get close to the big house? To get closer to your master? Because the reality is you might be raped. But it's possible that he won't sell his own children down the river as quickly. So it's possible that if you allow yourself to be raped, that you might be able to hold on to your children. Or do you resist that and have your own kids, knowing that at a moment's notice, somebody could walk in, buy your own children out from underneath you, and you would never see them again? See, that's the difference between just talking about race and realizing the very real implications of what race means, of why it's important. That is the power of race as a social construct. Who gets to be white? Who gets to be black? So how did we get here? How do we get to where we are today? If race is a social construct, how was it created? How was it first constructed? A little bit of history for you. As Europeans began exploring the world, they needed a lens to properly understand and position themselves vis-a-vis other peoples. And I can imagine it was probably incredibly overwhelming. You've lived in Europe, in a part of Europe, for generations. People did not travel. You live in one place for generations of time, and for generations of time, everybody around you in your village for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, they've all looked the same as you, they've talked the same, they practice the same religion, they eat the same food, everybody's the same. And all of a sudden, you get dropped in an expedition in the middle of Latin America or in the middle of West Africa or North Africa, and everybody is different. They look differently, they speak a different language, they're worshiping different gods, they're eating foods that you don't recognize, the smells are different. I imagine it was incredibly overwhelming. And people needed somehow, some way to understand Europeans encountering all these peoples, and they're saying, my goodness, well, they must be some kind of human because they have eyes and they have ears and hands and feet and they procreate in the same way as we do. So there's got to be human, but they can't be the same kind of human as we are because look how incredibly different they are. It's just amazing how different they are. So the assumption was it was sort of like wolves to dogs, right? Same animal, different breed. And as Europeans began expanding and philosophy began to take these ideas around race and flesh them out, the more it became discussed, the more it became the differences between peoples became more and more established, the easier and easier it was to explain that those differences are not just due to some kind of cultural thing, but that they are fundamental biological differences between peoples. That there was a biological reason why these people in this area did these certain things. And so the idea of race began to grow and take more responsibility for actions, right? Oh, they did that because of this idea of race. They did it because they were black. Well, that's just how black people act. Oh, that's just how they act. So race becomes first a way of sort of orienting yourself to this world and all these differences, and then it begins to take on character, begins to take on reasoning. And as race begins to develop, very quickly, Europeans, as they're discussing race, surprise, surprise, discover that European races, the white race, is superior to other races. I think they were just being really bad observers. They had guns, and these other people didn't have guns. Well, maybe that means we're more industrious than they are. We show up in North America, everybody starts to die. Well, they were dying because of smallpox and disease and that kind of a thing. But the Europeans would say things like, my goodness, they have terrible constitutions here. That's probably because they're inferior. So terrible, terrible observations. But race quickly descends into a hierarchy. You cannot have the idea of race without the idea of hierarchy. And as these ideas continue to grow, the slave trade begins to pick up. And once the slave trade hits, really hits in like, not really even well, like mid to late 1600s into the 1700s, once the slave trade really picks up in earnest, race takes on a tremendous amount of social currency. It really means something to be black and to be white. It really means something, okay? You have rich agricultural opportunities in North and South Americas. Europe is beginning to explore these opportunities and take advantage of them. And they wanted to grow. They needed resources. They needed raw material for Europe. So the first thing they tried to do was enslave the indigenous peoples in North and South America. And tragically, because of the advent of European diseases, smallpox, influenza, native populations were just decimated. They estimate that 90% of all Native Americans, indigenous peoples in North and South America, perished because of European disease. So they needed more labor. So they started bringing indentured servants over from Europe. A few problems with that. First off, indentured servants, there wasn't a ton of demand for it. There was some demand, but not a lot. Not a lot of people signed up. And secondly, you have an indentured servant. He comes and he works on your plantation for 7 years or 8 years, and then you have to let him go. And not only that, but he goes across town and opens up a farm that competes with you because you've just spent the last 8 years teaching him all your best practices for running a farm. So, you're sort of breeding your own competition at that point. So the African slave trade came under focus, and Europeans began shifting their attention and fulfilling the labor obligations with African slaves. And just as a little thing, it really bothers me when people try to bring up the fact that there was already slave trades going on prior to European slave trade. Guys, it is absolutely 100% different. To say that one African tribe which goes and attacks or invades another tribe and carries off 2 dozen, people or so and enslaves them in a tribe that's 50 miles away from their original homeland, to say that that is at all comparable to the deportation of millions of people. And then we're talking about the 1700s. There is not billions of people in the world. To deport millions of people and take them not 50 miles away, but across an entire ocean into a land that they are completely unfamiliar with, and force them into slavery, into servitude for centuries of them and their children and their grandchildren through generations of people. It's absolutely not comparable. Whatever slave trades existed in Africa or in indigenous groups cannot possibly hold a candle to the enormity of the European slave trade. It was incredible. You're talking about tens of millions of people, individuals, who were subjected to slavery, many of whom died. Like I said, 2 million people in the Middle Passage, and then millions more of disease once they reached the Americans, and of overworking, and some of resistance, of suicide, resistance through suicide, or resistance through warfare. Race began to take on social currency. Now, let me explain what I mean by that social currency. I'm a pastor of a church here in Lincoln City. When I go places and people find out that I'm a pastor, I get treated differently. Sometimes I get treated more positively, and hey, I like that. Sometimes I get treated more negatively. And it's like, okay, well, you got to even it out, take the bad with the good. But the label of pastor, which I have, has a certain amount of social currency to it. It means something to people. When you say you're a pastor, it means something. It has value. Could be bad or good, but it has currency. Once the slave trade is acting in earnest, blackness and whiteness mean something. They've taken on new weight in society. It means something to be black, and it means something to be white. What it's built on is it's built on an idea of, like in the definition I say, white normalcy. That is to say that whiteness becomes the standard for racial identity. So if white Europeans have a certain form of government and Asians have a certain form of government, then a white form of government will be called advanced, and the Asian government will be called primitive. And if whites have a certain kind of society, a certain way of raising their children, and Native Americans have a certain way of raising their children, well, then the white way is called the civilized way, and the native way is called the savage way. And we begin to identify that the white European mode of living, the white European lens, the idea that that race begins to take on value as the standard of human races. So that if Europeans acted like this, if white Europeans acted like this and other people acted like that, this is right, that is wrong, and it's the duty of this to change that into this. Once race has social currency, white supremacy becomes the goal of society. I'll say that again. Once race has social currency, white supremacy becomes the goal of society. It's the end game. It's what we want to replicate. It's what we want to follow. Native Americans have to be civilized. They're different than, they need to be changed similar to. Kill the Indian, save the man. That was the mantra of the boarding schools, which I'm sorry to say were very much run by the church and the US government. They would kidnap Native American children, take them to a boarding school, cut their hair, make them wear westernized clothing, forbid them to speak in native languages, teach them about white culture, white way of being, because the assumption was what we need to do is rid this person of all cultural indicators that might bear the label of native, and instead replace them with an idealized, read, white identity. We need to remove every cultural and socially engineered identifier which communicates other, Native American, Black, Asian. The assumption was and is that the white European way of doing things was the normal way of doing things. And you know, the amazing thing is you can still see this in our world today. If you go to a grocery store and you find the food labeled ethnic foods, what do you find in that aisle? You find Hispanic food, you find Japanese and East Asian foods. Now, does it ever strike anybody as odd that what that is assuming is that certain kinds of food are ethnic? And by definition, therefore, all the other food in the grocery store is just food. It's not ethnic, it's just normal food. The tuna salad and the vegetables and the ice cream and the milk and the eggs, that's just normal food. But here in this aisle we have ethnic food, abnormal food, not normal food. And that's not to say it's bad food, but that's just to say it's not food. It's just ethnic food. There's something incredibly powerful when you can say, I'm just an American. I'm not all these other things. I'm a normal American. I'm simply an American. You over there, you're not normal. You're ethnic. I'm normal. I was doing a research project when I was in college, and one of the tasks was that I was giving people pictures of different people of different races and asking them, can you identify this person or this person's race? Can you identify this person's race? And it was really interesting because people would do this. They would say, that's a black man, he's Asian, he's Latino, he's American, he's black, he's American. And I realized that white people were American, whereas black people were black. In other words, it is normal. It is baseline, frankly, socially accepted to be white. And in some latent way, white supremacy, these ideas of race, lend themselves to genocide. Because ultimately, you can't change the other person enough. Even if a Native American person accepts and assimilates, you can't change them enough so that they are fully white. Once white people realize that they can't change people of color enough to make them white, the only solution, the final solution, is to destroy those people. Race leads to white supremacy and white normalcy, and white supremacy and white normalcy leads to genocide. That's just how it works. You could be a lawyer working for a white firm. You could live in suburbia. You could be an Eagle Scout. You could be high class. You could go to an all-white church, but when a police officer pulls you over, when you enter a store, when you go to a white neighborhood that you haven't been before, you lose all of those things and you simply become black. You could volunteer at animal shelters. You could be a vegetarian, a pacifist. You could be a decent human being. But when literal push comes to shove, you are a threat because you're black. Race is a powerful social construct. It's built with the assumption of whiteness, and it's designed to prop up white supremacy. And the people who suffer under it are real people. Elijah McClain was a real person, not a statistic, not a number, not a story, a person with a mom and a dad and brothers. I think that if you walked away from this talk with anything, I hope that it would be with the idea that race is a complex institution, varied in its application. But at its heart, at its goal, race is designed to destroy the lives of people who are not white Europeans. It really, really is. And I think that the question of, what do we do with that? Well, that's a good question. And that's a question that we need to address. We need to get there. But I think that as white people, we oftentimes, because we're uncomfortable with this topic, we skip really, really quickly to, oh, well, what can I do about it? I need to change. I need to do something about it. And we don't take the necessary time to understand, to lament, to cry, to let ourselves dwell in the enormity of the issue. I realize that you want to go out and do things, but I would just ask how much your motivation is, I'd like to get things done because talking about this makes me feel uneasy. And if I can do things, then I don't have to feel uneasy. Maybe you should be uneasy for a little bit. Maybe you should rest in the discomfort of this a little bit. Black people have been enslaved in this country for 400 years. 400 years of prejudice and discrimination and destruction. You can't wait a few days, a few minutes. You're so uncomfortable that you want to get out of this as quickly as possible. Maybe you should wait a little bit. Think a little bit harder. Educate yourself a little bit more. Understand the history a little bit better. Listen a little bit more clearly. Wait. Yeah. It's great that you have enthusiasm. Happy about that very much. I'd much rather you be effective in the ways that you dismantle racism. That's what I'm interested in. Can we be effective? Because sometimes our efforts to remove racism only increase racial hardship for other people. That happens when we jump really quickly to action and we don't spend enough time in reflection. So with that, I'm going to transition now and we're going to answer some of the questions that came up at the meeting the other night.
Contrary to what your eyes may be telling you, I have not changed shirts. That's not true. I have. But I wanted to answer some of the questions that came up at the end of our discussion last week. Um, and I thought there were some really good ones. There was three questions that came up. The first one was, is race and ethnicity the same thing, or are they different? Um, from a sociological perspective, they are different. They are not the same thing. Race refers to, like I have been talking about, a social construct which is largely arbitrary and malleable and invented, and especially invented within white dominant cultures in order to justify and normalize whiteness against other perceived races. Ethnicity refers to the language, culture, religion, worldview, often geographic setting of a particular group of people. So, for example, I am of Scottish ancestry, and from the MacGregors tribe, from the McNeeses and the MacGregors. That's a particular ethnic identity. MacGregor speaks to a specific subgroup of people who occupied a certain area of Scotland, spoke a similar dialect. The Hmong people of Southeast Asia, Thailand, that sort of thing, mountain peoples, is an ethnicity. Asian, covers the entire swath of the continent of Asia, which is humongous, with thousands and thousands of different ethnic peoples in that group. Hundreds of Native American tribes, and you can make an argument that each one of those has particular ethnic identities, whether that has to do with language or belief or culture or whatnot. But they all fall underneath the label of Native American or indigenous when we're talking about race. Again, because race is a social construct meant to categorize a lot of people, and ethnicity is very much more specific and tied to ideas around custom, culture, heritage, that sort of thing. Another question that came up, which was great, a really good question, was, what would you say to a white person who is sort of encountering this for the first time and undergoing a lot of internal dissonance? White guilt is something that we talk about, which is a real thing. I think I would say that uh, it's good. It's good to stare full face into those realities. We want to oftentimes hold them at arm's length. And we do that through a lot of different ways. We do it through action, we do it through denial, we do it through rationalization, we do it through justification. A lot of us don't like that feeling that you get, that you may have been experiencing even listening to this talk. It's cognitive dissonance. There's the person who we know we should be, the person who we would like to be, and then all of a sudden you get sort of confronted with the person that you are, with the reality of whiteness that you didn't necessarily choose for yourself, but that you do have. And those are kind of competing. We want to be this person that's a good person, but we have this whiteness, which is inherently wrong and bad and evil. So what do you do with that cognitive dissonance? So the first thing, again, I would say is, don't push it off. Don't hold it at arm's length. Don't justify and rationalize and get yourself off the hook. Just spend some time being uncomfortable. Spend some time feeling that dissonance. Cry. You need to be able to cry. You need to be able to lament. You need to be able to express frankly, the horror of the reality that we're living in. And I think that when people don't allow themselves to cry, don't allow themselves to lament, you run the risk of simply getting over that emotional burden as quickly as possible and not really dealing with it internally, because it is an internal reality, and that's a very true internal struggle. The person who you want to be, the person who you idealize, and the person who is now sort of coming to the forefront are two very different people. and you have to reconcile those people. You have to be able to reconcile those two people. I remember I do genealogy as a part of, just as a hobby. Several members of my house, members of my family that have owned slaves. And when you actually see that, and you see the names, never last names, only first names, and you see, you read the will of somebody, and they say, I'm giving this slave to this person. And you see it right there, and you realize that was your family, that was you. Again, that cognitive dissonance of the person I want to be versus my family and what my family has done. And yeah, it's hard. That is hard. But I think that the important thing is to acknowledge that and to look at it, to not shy away from it, to not click past it or ignore it, to look at it and realize that is the reality. That's the reality of me. That's a part of who I am. So that's the first thing I would say, is just dwell in that place a little bit first. The other thing I would say is, in Christianity, we talk about this idea of repentance. Repentance means turning away from a wrong path. It's the realization that I was going down this path, and I'm discovering it was wrong. And so I'm not just saying I don't want to walk down that path anymore. I am turning and I'm walking down that path. We need to, as white people, we need to, in a sense, repent. We need to recognize the ways we participated in racism, recognize the ways that we have participated in that, and then we need to turn away from it and start walking down a new path. But we need to make changes in the way that we live, in the way that we think, in the things that we believe, in the things that we ingest, and the things that we speak out. We need to change. The last thing I would say is that nobody can go back in time and change the past, right? I can't go back and convince my family not to hold slaves. Nobody can go back in time and take back what we've done to Native Americans or African Americans or any other peoples. Nobody can take that back. You can't change the past. That's the reality of it. You really can't. You do have control over your present and over your future. That is something you can change. That is something you can control. How are you going to change the way that you talk and the way that you think and the way that you act today and tomorrow? How are you going to educate your children? How are you going to work to dismantle these things? And doing things like educating your kids or talking to them about race or talking to them about slavery, things that they're not going to be hearing in their public school, maybe. That is a part of what dismantling racism is all about. Empowering the next generation. You're not going to be able to change the world, but you can control what you can control. So that's what I would say to white people who might be feeling that dissonance right now. The last question was, what about some of the anger that we see in these discussions, especially from African American communities? I would say that that's a good question, in that it's a very honest question. I appreciate that honesty. Really appreciate the honesty. But I would say that it sort of assumes a few things. Number one, about anger. Sometimes anger can be an expression of hatred. Sometimes anger can be an expression of honesty. If you see somebody being abused, you might become very, very angry. Not out of a sense of hatred, but out of a sense of duty, out of a sense of righteous anger, right? So when somebody speaks out in righteous anger, I don't get offended by that at all. I'm happy that people are angry about wrongdoings. I think we all should be happy about that, right? If we see somebody being abused and nothing inside of us is moved to anger, then that's like sociopathic, right? Like that's very. I hope that you would get a little angry. So I think for a lot of people's, yeah, they do get angry, and maybe they should be justified a little bit in their anger. So I hope that you don't. I hope that you don't always interpret their anger as hatred, because I think probably it's more it should be easily interpreted as anger at injustice. And that's anger we should get behind. That's anger that we should say, yeah, I'm on board with that anger. Um, that doesn't mean that it's going to lead us to hatred. It doesn't mean it's going to lead us to violence. But it is righteous anger to say, this, look at this injustice. It is wrong. It is evil. And it should be rejected at all levels. Well, a couple other things. The first thing I would say is oftentimes when we say, oh, that's an angry black person or an angry Latino or an angry Latina, um, it's oftentimes an excuse so that we don't have to listen to what they have to say. And that's not right. It's not just because somebody's angry doesn't mean that they're not right, right? So you need to be able to listen even when somebody's yelling. And I have learned to just try my best to listen, to not get all upset and try to get all defensive and fight back. So don't back away from that. There might be something there to learn. And see, the last thing I was going to say was that it is, how to say this? Part of white privilege is being able to talk about race the way that you want to talk about race. Part of white privilege is being able to say, hey, I'm going to go talk about race for an hour and then I'm going to go home and not think about it for a little while. For people of color, that discussion is not an option. It's a part of the way that they have to live. It is a privilege, it is a genuine privilege to sit at the feet of people of color or people who have been oppressed in any way and listen to them and gain knowledge and understanding and wisdom from their perspective. And so I consider it a privilege when people of color speak out, and I try my best to listen to what they have to say, recognizing that I can't control how they say it, nor should I control how they say it. Sometimes things need to be yelled. So I guess that's what I would say to that. If you say something wrong, by the way, if you're coming into this as a new, sort of figuring things out white person, and you are around people of color and you say something wrong and somebody starts unloading onto you, and in a way that's a gift. It's a gift to be able to hear them and say, okay, I recognize what I did wrong there. Thank you for pointing that out. I don't want to get defensive about this. I'm figuring this out. I really, really appreciate your patience with me. I really appreciate how you're helping me out here. Thank you for that. I'm going to try to do better in the future. Appreciate you letting me know. That's the attitude that you should take. If somebody unloads on you, take that attitude. Believe me, it'll be much better, because there's things that you need to learn. And you're going to make mistakes, and that's just how it's going to be. Okay. Better to be there and make a mistake and learn from your mistake than to never be there and never make a mistake and exist in ignorance. All right. That's the end of that. Thanks, guys, for hanging out for this chat. We're going to try to get another one going. Probably not in the next week, but maybe in 2 weeks from now, we'll try to get another one of these things going and see what happens to it. Leave some feedback, leave some comments, shoot me an instant message or something like that. Let me know what you're thinking, and let me know if you have any more questions, and we'll try to address them. All right. Thanks, guys. Peace out.